webinar is on 7th as
7th
already
7th
7th.
या हाँ
Next
उसका
Saturday.
ही पोस्टर अभी आखिरी में पोस्टर दिखाएंगे उसका.
ठीक है.
Guys, Pujari, it's 12 o'clock. I think we should start.
Okay, so welcome friends, and I'm very happy to meet our dear friends today for a new series of webinars, and it's appropriately called Spine Masterclass by NSI. And the way this is conceived is to discuss one case threadbare, a complex spine case, where after presentation of the case as well as the options of decision making, we can have a frank discussion. And the discussion will not only be amongst the panelists, but the audience participation is most welcome. So I would request all of you to actively participate. Put in your questions as we go along in the question box or the chat box, and I'm sure the moderator will take it up. If there is something very interesting, we can probably unmute you and get you to talk to the speakers directly. The program, today's program is being moderated by Professor Shashank Kale, who's the Chief of Neurosurgery at All India Institute in New Delhi. And we have an eminent panel of our President, Professor Lokendra Singh, Dr. Muthu Kumar, both of whom are very spine enthusiasts. And we also have a minimally invasive specialist, Dr. Raja Kumar Deshpande. So we should have a spectrum of various options discussed during this meeting. And I look forward to the interaction. Over to Dr. Kale, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Dev Pujari. So let me just give a brief outline of how this case is going to flow today. So I'm going to moderate, so I'm going to be kind of the in-between person. And the two people who are going to be presenting are Dr. Sachin, who is an additional professor in my department, and Dr. Kanwaljit, who is an associate professor in my department. So, and you have the panel, which you have already been introduced to, Professor Muthu Kumar, Dr. Lokendra Singh, and Dr. Raja Kumar Deshpande. So the way this case will flow is, first Sachin will come and he will present the case. He will present the case briefly, of course, not like a case presentation typical in neurosurgery, but a brief outline of the patient's history, that is the symptoms and the signs. And then the panel will probably may come to a conclusion that, okay, the diagnosis is this or that or whatever. Or if there is some discussion, there can be some discussion, but we have been asked to limit this discussion, the case discussion, to maybe a few minutes, that's all. And once that case is done, then the panel will ask for the rest of the investigation. Sachin will again present everything, the X-rays, MRI, CT scan, whatever it may be. And then again, the panel will decide the best option, what to do for this patient. And after that discussion, we stop. Dr. Kanwaljit Garg will then take over. He will present to us what is the evidence for this kind of a case. What does the literature say? What are the different options which we have? And what are the outcomes of those different options? Once Kanwaljit Garg has told us what is the evidence on record right now, then we go back to Dr. Sachin. I mean, there may be some discussion from the panel about all this and the audience. And finally, Dr. Sachin goes back to tell us what exactly did we do in my department about this case. And then we discuss whether it was managed rightly, wrongly, or something better could have been done. And if there is another case like that, what are we going to do? So that's how this flow of this case is going to be. I hope Professor Lokendra Singh, Dr. Muthu Kumar, and Dr. Raja Kumar, if you have any questions about the workflow of this case presentation, I can answer them right now. Otherwise, I will ask Dr. Sachin to take over.
Let's start.
Okay.
Okay.
I think that Sachin can take over.
Okay, Sachin, please start. So another thing before you start, Sachin, I just want to tell the audience and the moderators that Dr. Kanwaljit Garg is the one who is responsible for looking at the responses. I mean, if somebody wants to speak, or if somebody wants to type in or in the chat box type a question, then it's Dr. Kamaljeet's responsibility to present it to the speaker, either to me or to the panelists. Okay. Okay,
Is my
Sachin.
screen visible?
Yes,
Yeah.
it is.
Yeah.
It is.
So, good morning and warm welcome to this new webinar series. As Dr. Kale just introduced, I'll be presenting the case. So, coming to the case straight away, this is a 39-year-old female who came to our OPD, a housewife by occupation, a resident of Motihari, Bihar, with a chief complaints of backache for last 8 months and stiffness in both lower limbs for last 6 months. So these were her chief complaints, backache as well as stiffness in lower limbs. Backache was insidious in onset, gradually progressive, localized mainly in the mid-back region, more on the left side. It was dull aching, moderate in intensity, no radiation, no diurnal variation, though she complained that it is a bit aggravated by lying down. From the past 4 months, the pain has increased in intensity. Patient now complains of it as a heaviness on prolonged standing and walking. From the past 4 months, she also has developed some numbness in bilateral foot. And on asking some leading questions, she also complains of mild sensory impairment below the level of umbilicus. She also complains of some stiffness, which is involving bilateral lower limbs as her chief complaint. There is no history of any band-like sensation, no history of any obvious weakness which the patient complains, no history of bladder bowel complaints, no history of trauma, no history of fever, night cries, anorexia, weight loss, no history of any local swelling in the back or elsewhere in the body, no history of any surgery or medical illness, or no significant family history. So to summarize, she is a 39-year-old female with insidious onset, gradually progressive, dull aching, moderate intensity backache in the mid-back region without any radiation for the last 6 months, stiffness involving both lower limbs for last 6 months, sensory impairment below the level of umbilicus since last 4 months without any bladder bowel involvement. So this is in brief the case history.
Okay, so to the eminent panel, would you ask some question here, or you want to proceed with the examination straight away?
Would you like us to make a hazard a guess at this point of time?
Oh, sure.
Yeah,
That's
one
what
question only.
Yeah.
Dr.
Yeah,
Kale,
please, sir.
just
Yeah.
one. Though she's 39 years old female, just I wanted to ask about obstetric history because sometimes there can be late deliveries. What was there any history pertaining to recent delivery or something?
No, sir. No, nothing like that. So no personal or family history was not significant.
Okay, thank you.
So traditionally, in a case in our department, whenever somebody presents a case, we stop at this history and then try to make a diagnosis. I mean, that's what probably is done everywhere in every neurosurgery department. So if you look at this summary, 39 years, insidious onset, not too many problems neurologically, some stiffness, some sensory impairment, and there is definitely no bowel bladder problem. And as asked by Professor Lokendra Singh, there was nothing in the obstetric history or nothing in the history to suggest any other problem apart from this. So would anybody like to hazard a guess? I mean, this is an open book. It could be anything. That's what I can think of.
I would hazard a guess,
Yeah.
saying that it is a cord involvement, possibly. Anything about the thoracic cord. Historically, there is no mention of any upper limb involvement or neck symptoms, so anything above. And if there is absolutely nothing to complain of or nothing she has experienced in the hands or the shoulders, you would experience that probably it's a thoracic kind of problem. Is just a sort of a fair way of putting it.
Yeah, Dr. Lokendra Singh, you were saying something.
Yeah, actually, yes. Actually, depending on the history, because it is insidious, she's 39 years old female. And the sensory level, though it is not a very surefire way of labeling the level of the lesion, but that is umbilicus. I suspect some dorsal pathology. It is insidious, so probably a neoplastic pathology. Considering her age, probably a meningioma, and somewhere in the region of somewhere between D7, D8, D9, that level, somewhere, because you can add 4 levels to the cord level. You have to actually minus the level of sensory level, So because the disparity between the cord segment and the spinal this thing. So somewhere D7, D8, D9, probably a meningioma starting on the left side, and then pressing the cord to right, displacing it to the right gradually.
Dr. Muthukumar, would you like to?
Just classical description of intradural extramedullary lesion is that it should present with a classical radicular pain, which is absent in this particular case. So the pain in this particular patient is suggestive of osteoligamentous etiology. And the patient gives a clear-cut history of stiffness of the lower extremities. Her difficulty in walking is probably because of UMN involvement, which is due to spasticity. And she gives a very, as Dr. Logendra pointed out, is a very clear sensory level of umbilicus, which means D10 cord level, which, as rightly pointed out by Dr. Logendra Singh, should be at D7 vertebral level, somewhere around D7, D8 vertebral level. But I am not in favor of a intradural pathology. I would prefer an extradural pathology in this particular case.
Any specific reason why you think it's an extradural?
Because there is one is the insidious onset. There's a clear sensor loss, no radicular pain to suggest intradural extramedullary lesion, and there is there's no early bladder involvement despite 9 months history. So that's the reason why I think it's an extradural lesion.
Yeah. So if I were to summarize this discussion, I would say the first diagnosis is definitely not intramedullary. At least I can say that much. So it's a toss between intradural extramedullary. Again, we don't have the classical presentation of an intradural extramedullary lesion. And the second obvious choice would then we will be left with an extradural problem causing problems at this level. Anyhow, what I can summarize from the history is that there is some kind of compression going on at the level of D7 or D8 vertebra, which corresponds to the sensory level of D10, which is around the umbilicus. And as far as the etiology is concerned, the panel feels it could be anything from an intradural extramedullary to an extradural level. I would also add, I mean, if you just have to complete the list, you can also add a vascular problem. I mean, I've seen dural AV fistulas present like this: insidious onset, gradually progressive, and ultimately you investigate everything and you find out that, oh, it's a dural AV fistula. A simple operation of knocking off the connection usually treats these patients. Anyhow, so my diagnosis or my summary of the differential here would be a toss-up between an IDEM, that's an intradural extramedullary, or extradural pathology. And since we have nothing to suggest about tuberculosis, but still in India, anything can present, tuberculosis can present as anything. So just to complete the list, I would probably add this inflammatory lesion tuberculosis also to this list. All of us must have seen many times. Yeah. Yeah, Dr. Rajkumar Kumar.
One of the things that is interesting in this particular patient everybody has to mute the phone.
Somebody needs to mute his telephone.
स्टिफनेस है अभी वो मेनिंजियोमा है तो स्टिफनेस को
Yeah. All right.
Yeah. Okay.
One of the things that is in the forefront of all symptoms is back pain.
Yeah.
Typically, if there is a benign neoplastic lesion, pain is not such a big symptom in the forefront. So basically, if it is something like an osteoligamentous lesion, it has a more tendency to produce pain. I'm not saying that that is the only thing, but the patient has presented first with back pain, or what we call as a symptom that causes something painful. So Typically, intramedullary lesions don't come with pain. And extramedullary lesions tendency is to produce pain. So this differentiation has to be kept in mind.
Right, sir. So I think I have instructions from the powers that be that please push on. So I think let us go to the next and look at what the examination revealed to us. So Sachin,
Can I just add one point, Dr. Kale? One single point can I add?
Yes, please.
You see, the pain is dull aching pain, which is of moderate intensity only. So it doesn't go much in favor of extradural lesion, because in extradural lesion, the pain is severe comparatively, not a dull aching pain, which is diffuse. And that's why it goes more in favor of intradural extramedullary.
Yeah, I mean, I think one point to stress over here is that the typical or the pathognomic features of an extradural, what we routinely teach are pain and deformity. You know, if you have pain and deformity, then you start thinking definitely of including an extradural lesion. However, because the dorsal spine is a bit confusing, so you know we can never rule it out, so to say. However, let us proceed with the examination. Sachin, please carry on.
So just a minute, there's a question in the chat box. Someone is trying to ask, can we know if the symptoms are ascending or descending?
So Sachin, please answer this.
So ascending.
Okay.
You carry on,
So
Sachin.
on examination, general physical examination was unremarkable. There was no sigma feature suggestive of neurofibromatosis. On a neurological examination, tone was increased in both lower limbs. Bulk was, however, normal. Power was in bilateral hip, knee, ankle, DHL, all movement. It was 4+/5. Bilateral knee jerk and ankle jerk were 3+. Superficial reflex, the plantar was upgoing and the abdominal reflex was present in the upper half. However, it was absent in the lower half. On sensory examination, there was 10 to 20% sensory impairment to all modalities of sensation from D11 and below. Local examination of the spine was unremarkable. There was normal curvature, no knuckle, no local deformity, except for a mild tenderness over D8, D9 spinous process on palpation. Rest of the neurological examination was normal. So considering the history and examination, the clinical diagnosis in this case, what we made was a dorsal myelopathy with a spinal level of D11, which corresponds approximately to a vertebral level of D8. So again, it is open to discussion what it can be, though we discussed everything from neoplastic to...
So I think in the interest of time, I mean, this examination has not added anything significant to our knowledge from the history. So I think our list of differential diagnosis remains the same. And I think we can proceed with it if the panel permits, or if they want to clarify something, please do.
I don't think the examination has added anything to our already existing knowledge. I think it should be wise to proceed further if the other two panelists agree.
Yeah. Dr. Lokendra Singh, anything, sir?
No, I think it doesn't add really anything. Let's move forward.
Okay,
Yeah.
carry on. Sachin, please carry on.
Yeah. So what next? What investigation first should be advised to this patient?
So I have kept this question here because typically in an examination setting, and our targeted audience is the young people who are likely to appear in some exam or the other. And many times they're asked this question, what investigation will you do? So it can be a tricky question. It could mean, please tell one investigation. Context can be different. One, what is the diagnostic test which you will do to completely make sure of your diagnosis? That is one question. Second is, you are in a big hospital clinical OPD setting. What will you do next? There is a big line of patients behind. You are seeing this patient. What will you do? So it could mean different things in a different context. However, I open it to the panel to really put this question in the context, that what do they mean when they ask what next?
Dr. Kale, irrespective of where the patient is being seen, whether it's she is being seen in an academic center or in a corporate sector or in a freelancers clinic, in this particular case, my first
Well,
line.
something wrong with the microphone. He's become all still and silent. So I think Dr. Lokendra Singh, you can take over.
Hello?
What exactly do you?
Dr. Muthukumar is audible, sir.
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yeah,
Yes,
you are audible.
So,
Yeah.
irrespective of whether the patient is being seen in an academic center or in a freelancer's clinic, anywhere else, for this particular patient, my first line of investigation will be a MRI.
Okay. A contrast MRI, sir?
That will be depending. That will depend whether what the plain MRI shows. If the plain MRI shows something which does not require a contrast, I will not advocate a contrast. That is left to the decision of the radiologist. Radiologist will decide depending upon what he finds on the plain MRI whether to proceed with contrast. I can judge it now.
Okay. So I mean, I asked this question many times to the residents, that you tell me what will you write on the form. So, the answer I expect is MRI of the dorsal spine. Yeah. Contrast if needed. 3, screen the whole spine. 3, screen the whole spine. I would expect that kind of an answer. However,
Yeah,
Dr. Raja.
So what
Let
I
me clarify
normally
one thing, Dr. Kale. At least the centers, scan centers in my place, a whole spine screening, one sagittal image of the whole spine is a part of our imaging protocol. So it comes by default. But I completely agree with you that whole spine screening is a must in this case.
So in our center, what we do is that we ask for in all patients plain X-rays, AP lateral, MRI of the particular region of interest, in this case dorsal, with whole spine screening with contrast, and of course a bunch of blood tests, including ESR and CRP, in patients whom we think the patient may have infective disease pathology. So I think a bunch of tests may be necessary in this particular patient to find out where the problem is.
Hello.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, sir, go ahead.
Yeah. No, actually, I agree that first line of investigation is obviously MRI scan with a spinogram, whether it is included in the protocol or not, but it should be available. That is first thing. I fully agree with Dr. Deshpande, but if it varies. In my opinion, the investigative line differs from a teaching institute and a practicing institute. For example, in my institute, I will not ask for estrogen and progesterone, indicators for whether it is in a pregnant woman, whether it is a meningioma or what, because those can be important. In the same way, I will not probably in my institute do investigation to rule out tuberculosis. In this case, first of all, I'll do MRI. But in teaching institute, I think those can be included for the sake of completion of the investigation for teaching purpose. X-ray, I don't find any use until unless there's an infective pathology. In the same fashion, CT, spine, bone cuts, if I expect some infective pathology and bony destruction, then probably I'll go for that. Otherwise not.
Dr. Kale, can I interrupt for a minute? Dr. Kale?
You have to unmute, Dr.
So
Kale.
you're not audible, sir. You probably have to unmute yourself.
Sorry.
Dr.
Please
Kale,
go
you're
ahead.
not.
Dr. Muthukumar, please go ahead.
I think I agree with what Dr. Lokendra Singh says. My choice would be to first do an MRI and then proceed with the other investigations like brain radiograph, CT, blood investigation, depending upon what we find in the MRI.
Okay.
That will be my line of treatment.
Yeah.
So
Agree.
So let me just summarize this whole discussion. That okay, the first obvious step anywhere in any OPD, whether it's in a hospital or in a clinic or wherever, would be to try and reach a diagnosis. And I think an MRI is the best a best investigation which can lead you to a diagnosis right away. I mean, if the radiologist feels a contrast is needed, you will have a contrast MRI. You will have a whole scan of the whole spine. So pretty much, I think more than 90% of the cases, the diagnosis will be pretty clear from this investigation alone. However, let me not belittle the importance of a simple plain X-ray of the thoracic spine, AP and lateral. You know, there are many things which can be picked up just on a simple X-ray, especially things like tuberculosis. However, since TB was not one of the focus areas of one of the important differential diagnoses in this list in this patient, the answer to this question would be an MRI. No doubt about it. It'll at least lead you down a certain path. You would know, okay, this is the diagnosis and this is what needs to be done. And then you can supplement this with X-ray or CT scan or whatever else you need. So Sachin, please carry on.
So we first did an X-ray, as it is readily available and we can get the result in half an hour in the OPD itself. So this was the X-ray findings of the patient. If you can see carefully, this is the 12th rib, and we can count from below upwards. So anyone would like to comment on the X-ray?
Dr. Lokendra Singh or Dr. Raja Kumar, would you like to comment anything on this X-ray, or is it a completely useless investigation?
I don't know, man. I can't make out really, because erosion of pedicle should have been there, if at all. This is one thing we can pick up, erosion of pedicle, which is not there. The winking owl image, you know, if it is a metastasis, which is extradural pathology, it's not there. You can't see any destruction of the vertebral end plates. You can't see any destruction there, and you don't see any change in the opacity of the vertebral body, if I use the X-ray term. It's not opacified at any level. So it's a normal X-ray.
Okay, Dr. Raja Kumar, any comments?
It looks to be reasonably okay from whatever film has been put, unless we are missing out something. So I think we should pass it off and go for the MRI. Are you finding anything that is unusual?
Dr. Muthukumar,
No,
would you
I
like
don't.
to comment?
I'm unable to find anything.
Okay.
I don't find.
So it's all like Dr. Lokendra Singh said, it's all negative findings in this. I don't see a soft tissue shadow around the spine. So there is definitely not a TB abscess. I see the pedicle, I see the both eyes of the owl at every level. So the pedicle is not destroyed. I see that the end plates are intact, etc., and all the other points which were listed by Dr. Lokendra Singh. So it seems to be okay, because our area of interest clinically was D8, D9, and Dr. Sachin had pointed out where is the D12 vertebra. So we can count up. The only thing which I think is, if you count from the last rib and assume the last rib to be D12, the last rib attached to the D12 vertebra, that's right. If you count above, that's D11, that's right, D10, D9, and D8. The only thing I see is the disk space between D8 and 9 is less than the disk spaces above and the disk spaces below. Apart from that, I don't see any significant abnormality over here. I don't know if the panel agrees with me. I don't know if the X-ray is visible as clearly to everybody or not. But to the naked eye, to the this space seems to we can
Yeah, sir. Your voice is breaking, Dr. Kale. Probably some connection issue.
Yeah, Wi-Fi is unstable.
Yeah. So please carry on.
Yeah. So the next investigation was definitely an MRI following this X-ray, which was largely didn't give us much information. This was the MRI, the T2 weighted sagittal images showing a compression at the D8, D9 level of predominantly ventral compression. and the axial images, you can see ventral compression at the level of D8, D9, a mild extension to the left side, but predominantly central compression. And on contrast enhancement, there was no contrast enhancement, so I didn't put that scan. So this was the picture on MRI. So what next now? What it is and what?
Okay, so can I ask the panel one by one to comment on this? Let me start with, I don't see Dr. Raja Kumar. So Dr. Lokendra Singh, maybe you can start.
Yeah, I don't know. It looks as if it has really bowled us well, because it looks like a large disc there. I don't know. It looks like a disc material.
So,
because disc at that level is totally black. D8, D9 disc is totally black, and you don't see, the disc material is not there. Probably it's a desiccated disc which has gone posteriorly and it is compressing the cord.
Okay.
Dr.
Anybody
Sachin,
else? Is Dr. Raja Kumar online?
Yeah, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes. So go ahead.
Dr. Sachin, the internet is bad and I just missed out. Can you just run the MRI for me again, please?
This is the
So, Dr.
sagittal
Muthukumar,
image.
would you like MRI?
Are you asking me, Dr. Kale? Dr. Kale, are you asking me or asking Dr. Rajkumar?
I think, sir, his connection is a bit.
Okay, fine. Rajkumar, do you want to comment anything on this, or shall I?
So basically, it appears to be like a bony kind of spur that may be coming at the disc level. So it is like a ossified or a calcified thoracic disc. So it is obviously pressing on the cord. I just wanted to see in all the cuts whether there were any T2-weighted changes. So obviously in the cuts that is shown, I cannot specifically say any T2-weighted changes, but the PLL is lifted or the dura is lifted at that level anteriorly. So you have a sort of a pyramid that's coming out, indicating that that's the lesion which is anterior at D8-9.
Yeah, Dr. Muthukumar, would you like to add something?
Sir, I fully concur with Rajkumar that this looks more like a thoracic disc, and as most of us know, that thoracic discs are notorious for calcification. And I think this is there is ample evidence in this MRI that it is not only huge, it's probably also heavily calcified. And my next investigation would be a CT spine. I wouldn't proceed with the CT spine dedicated to that particular level.
Okay, so this is the CT for you. As the panelist rightly pointed out, that it may be a calcified disc, and obviously it's the calcified disc at the D8, D9 level. In the axial cut, it becomes more clear. That's a dense calcification, which is almost bank central. And obviously the cord is lifted over this ventral compression. So we are dealing with a D8, D9 calcified disc herniation, which is dead ventral and more on the slightly on the left side. So these are the other cuts. So to just complete the list of investigation, would anybody like to have an preoperative EMG and CV in such case? And we already discussed the importance of screening MRI spine. And the other thing which we wanted to discuss is fluorosis workup. As the patient is also from a sub-Himalayan belt of Bihar, and Motiari comes in that belt. So that should also be kept in mind. So anybody does it routinely, the fluorosis workup and pre-op EMG and CV?
I think there is no role for, in my opinion, there is no role for preoperative EMG and nerve conduction studies, whereas the intraoperative monitoring is mandatory in this particular case. As for fluorosis workup, if the patient is from a known area which is known to be endemic for fluorosis, of course it should be done. So if the patient is known to be, and if the, but from the plain radiographs, I don't see much evidence of fluorosis in this particular patient. But if the patient is from an endemic area, no harm in getting a fluorosis workup done.
Okay.
I fully, I think my comments will be ditto as Muthu. Same.
Okay, so can you hear me? Is it back online?
Yeah,
you are
yes.
back.
Okay. So good. So, I mean, a simple fluorosis, what we do in the OPD for a simple, to try and see whether there's fluorosis or not, is up to see a simple X-ray of the form, which is the ulnar ligament and calcification, many times has helped us pick up fluorosis. And as far as the endemic area is concerned, the sub-Himalayan belt of the country is supposed to be an endemic area for fluorosis. That is the northern districts of Himachal, UP, Bihar, right up to the eastern part of the country. All the sub-Himalayan belt is supposed to be a fluorosis endemic. One of the major, I'm not saying there are some regions in the plateau region, in the Deccan also, which are endemic to fluorosis. So a good thing, you always should keep it in mind that fluorosis could be one of the things. And a simple investigation is an X-ray of the forearm, which shows calcification of the radioulnar ligament. However, I think we should proceed in the interest of time. So Sachin.
So the question, since the patient is largely intact, she has just some stiffness and backache, would anybody consider a conservative management in this case? Or because this case carries a high risk of neurological deterioration following surgery? It's a difficult surgery. The patient doesn't have much symptoms. She's walking, just some mild backache, some stiffness. So would anybody consider a conservative management, or all the panelists will go for surgery?
So I think now we come to the business end of this meeting. So what to do? One by one, I would request each one of the panelists to give an opinion about what to do. I mean, this question is, of course, incomplete. One part is surgery versus conservative, but if you think surgery, then what surgery? I also want you to comment on that. So I don't know. Let us start with Dr. Lokendra Singh first.
Yeah, actually, I'll prefer surgery. I will not consider this for conservative management, because there is a significant compression and slightest of fall, etc., can really worsen the patient sometimes badly, and irreparably there can be damage to the cord. In this case, because you cannot go posteriorly, so there are two possibilities are there. Either you will go transthoracic, or you can go posterolateral approaches like modified costotransversectomy single level, and using endoscope and microscope, because this is dead central. So the problem with the posterolateral approach is that you cannot see the other side of the, because it's dead midline. But if we use endoscope and microscope along with the micro dissection techniques, then my choice will be here costotransversectomy using endoscope and microscope, posterolateral approach. Obviously, costotransfer means it's a posterolateral approach.
Okay, Dr. Raja Kumar, would you like to comment?
Obviously, I don't believe in conservative management in a progressive myelopathy. This patient, I agree, requires surgery. And the choice of surgery for me is a transthoracic extrapleural, a sort of a minimally invasive at that point. I drill only the adjacent disc space, the posterior inferior surface of the above vertebra, the posterior superior surface of the inferior vertebra. So you can, about a centimeter can be drilled nicely like a drill hole, go all the way and angulate your drill from a little, 2/3, 1/3 junction into the anterior portion and drill that bone. on the extradural part. So using microscope, most of the things can be removed. A part which cannot be done can be used, like Dr. Lokendra Singh said, you can use an endoscope. I prefer to use an extradural transthoracic approach. We have done a few cases like that. And it is very, very simple because it is extrapleural. And if your pleura is intact, you don't need to have to put a thoracic, ICD or something like that. And the patient can be mobilized fast. The trick here is, as Dr. Muthukumar said, we need to have intraoperative neuromonitoring. Very important is to make sure that your drilling of the bone is complete. As you're nearing the cord, use diamond drill and a lot of irrigation so that heat doesn't get transmitted to the dura and across it. The dura can be calcified. So you may have a dural deficiency post-surgery, and you may have to use any method to reconstruct the dura. Suturing is very, very difficult in this location. I prefer to use glue after layering it nicely. And I think it's a very elegant surgery with excellent results, provided all the steps are followed in a stepwise fashion.
Dr. Muthukumar, your opinion?
I fully agree. There is absolutely no role for conservative management. There are only two choices as far as the approach is concerned. As was pointed out, either it's a transthoracic approach, or I would go either for a transthoracic approach, or the disadvantage with transthoracic approach in mid and lower thoracic spine is the problem of identification of the level intraoperatively using fluoroscopy. So that's one disadvantage, but otherwise one can safely drill the posterior portion of the vertebral body above and below, create a cavity, and then push the disc fragment, dissect the disc fragment into the cavity so created. The next option would be, or a better option would be, a lateral extracavitary, or one of the, it's nothing but an extension of the costotransverse activity, which Dr. Lokendra Singh pointed out. Only thing, we remove a little more, the longer the portion of the rib is removed, and it's a more lateral angle. It's basically an extension of the costotransversectomy. To do that, when one needs to, because the bony spur or the calcified disc is in the center, we may not get the necessary angle, so we have to tape the patient, and then maybe we may have to tilt the table also.
Actually, can I make a point here? This is a very important thing you said, that you have to tilt the table.
Please do, please do.
Yeah, here the modified costotransversectomy approach, you see, any table, for the youngsters, I must tell them, it turns only 30 degrees either way, not more than that. So to get extra turn, what you do, you put a patient on unequal bolsters. From the side you are operating, you put a larger bolster, and other side you put a smaller bolster. So patient is already tilted without tilting the table. And then you can turn the table extra. 30 degrees you earn extra. So that way you can turn the table. Patient will be turned 60 degrees. So that's the trick. And that's why it is called modified costotransversectomy. In this case, D8, D9. So you have to remove small part of D8 rib because they all run tangentially. So the D8 rib will cover the D8, D9 disc space. And posterolateral approaches are very simple approaches. They are very easy to perform. And you may not enter by and large into a pleural cavity because it is, and you can easily drill off. And the last part of the spur can be done by endoscope, which is maybe 5 degree or sometimes maybe even 30 degree you can use if you can't see the spur properly, and then you can drill it off. So the modified positioning is extremely important to get 60 degree turn instead of 30 degrees. So you can see the majority part of anteriorly placed pathology by this modification.
Can I ask a question to the other two panelists and to the moderator?
Yes.
Dr. Kale? We have lost Dr. Kale. Hello?
Hello? You can go ahead and ask.
Yeah. My question is, this is a single level disc in a well surrounded by thoracic cage, irrespective of whether you are doing a extrapleural approach or see, it's a question of semantics. Basically, all of us are going posterolaterally. Will you supplement it with instrumentation or not?
No, I wouldn't. I'll just take the rib, convert into pieces, and what I have drilled off, the cavity and the disc is not there. I'll just put those pieces inside that. That's it.
Okay. Dr. Rajkumar, obviously, you are also not doing fixation in such cases because you are doing a focused decompression.
Yeah, no
Yeah.
fixation.
So going ahead, again, role of intraoperative neuromonitoring is a must. We always do all such complex cases under intraoperative neuromonitoring. And again, the MEPs can be used here. The D wave is usually not effective below D9. So we used MEP in this case. Then surgery, we already discussed various approaches. And just for the sake of summarizing, laminectomy is not an option as the panelists discussed, but it's a dead ventral compression. Transfacetal pedicle sparing approach to the disc. Can somebody will take this approach for this case, Dr. Rajkumar? Yeah, your voice is not audible.
You are muted.
Okay,
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah.
I think when you're doing a transfestoral approach, you end up actually trying to enter part of the pedicle. It's basically a transpedicular approach, because the roots will come out when you remove the facet, the roots should not be damaged. So there are people who will say, I don't mind damaging one thoracic root to get a better access, because one thoracic root is not going to create so much of a problem, except for perhaps some post neurectomy pains. But my approach is never to damage a nerve or a vessel or vein or whatever, unless it's absolutely the necessity thing to do. So having said that, instead of pedicle sparing and sacrificing the nerve, I would rather spare the nerve and sacrifice the pedicle. So it's actually a transpedicular approach. We have done for soft disc transpedicular approach, especially if it is slightly to one side. But in a patient who has got a dead central calcified lesion, the angle of approach should be as much as possible anterior to posterior. If you try to take anything that takes a curve, you would end up to some degree either a visualization difficulty or a tendency to retract the dura. So I would, in my hands, use a transthoracic approach, basically because the angle of attack is very, very convenient.
Okay, so the other one we discuss is basically then the first two options are out. Then the third option remains the posterolateral costotransversectomy or a lateral extracavitary approach, as Dr. Lokendra Singh said. And again, the anterior transthoracic approach, either through the pleura or through the extrapleural. So basically two approaches. So I'll now ask my colleague, Dr. Kavaljit, to present evidence to what is there in the literature to support either of these approaches. Kavaljit, please.
Thank you, Dr. Sachin. Good afternoon, everyone. I'll be presenting the literature evidence on what we have just discussed: the thoracic disc herniation, the surgical approach, need of fusion, and the other things. Just few things about the epidemiology of thoracic disc herniation. Thoracic disc herniation can be seen in up to 37% of patients who on imaging who got imaging done due to some or the other reason. But most of these patients are asymptomatic, and symptomatic thoracic disc herniation is quite rare. And it is seen in symptomatic thoracic disc herniation accounts for 0.1 to 3% of all spinal disc herniations. And most of the symptomatic thoracic disc herniations occur in fourth or fifth decade of life. And about 75% of the cases occur in the lower half of the thoracic spine, with T11, T12 disc being the most common disc to get herniated because it's the most mobile out of all thoracic levels. Another unique feature of thoracic disc herniation is that more than 50% of the thoracic disc herniations are central, making the surgeon's job difficult. And more than 40% of these are calcified. And about 3 to 37% of patients can give some history of trauma, which is quite unlinked to it. And intradural extension of the thoracic disc herniation can be seen in up to 0.3% of the patients. Giant thoracic disc herniation is defined as when the disc herniation, the herniated part of the disc occupies more than 40% of the spinal canal. I think in this case, we are dealing with a giant thoracic disc herniation. These giant thoracic disc herniations are quite treacherous because most of them are central and calcified, and they have high tendency of intradural extension as compared to other disc herniations. The usual symptoms of thoracic disc herniation are pain and neurological deficits. While deciding a approach, while deciding in favor of approach either conservative or surgical in patients with thoracic disc herniation, one must remember that the thoracic spinal cord is more vulnerable to compression due to its unique anatomical features like narrow spinal canal, thoracic kyphosis, and precarious blood supply. And patients can develop neurological deficits very quickly in thoracic disc herniation, and many a times if the neurological deficit has developed, it may be irreversible. Hence some surgeons have recommended that even if the patient is asymptomatic but there is cord signal change on T2 or T1 weighted MRI images, they would prefer surgical intervention rather than conservatively managing the patient. Surgical approaches to thoracic disc herniation have been classified into three types: the anterior approach, the lateral approach, and the posterior approaches. Posterior approach, the laminectomy, it's the easiest, but it provides limited exposure and it requires significant dural and spinal cord retraction, which invariably results in spinal cord injury, especially in patients who have central disc herniation. Next is the transpedicular approach, in which in the classical transpedicular approach, which is the medial half of the facet and superior half of the pedicle is drilled, and it is a facet sparing approach, and there is no need for fusion after the classical transpedicular approach, and it is good for lateral disc herniations, but it is not suited for central or calcified discs. Coming to the posterolateral approaches, the first approach is costotransversectomy, as we have just discussed. It involves drilling of the transverse process, the pedicle, a small part of the vertebral body, along with the rib head. It is good for lateral and paracentral discs, it provides visualization better than transpedicular approaches, and it is extrapleural approach. So there is no need of postoperative chest tube insertion. However, it is not suited for central disc herniations, and it is not facet sparing. A lateral extracapillary approach is just an extension of costotransversectomy, as we just discussed. And parascapular approach is when scapula is mobilized for vertebral visualization of the anterior column, done in the superior half of the thoracic column. This slide shows the basic difference between costotransversectomy and lateral extracapillary approach. In lateral extracapillary approach, we excise around 8 centimeters of the rib apart from the head. So it provides us more horizontal view of the spinal canal as compared to costotransversectomy. LECA or lateral extracapillary approach is extrapleural. It provides good visualization of the midline structures, and one can access multiple levels also. However, there is limited visualization of the ventral and it might require fusion, and there might be pain in the postoperative period because of the intercostal nerves, and there is high risk of radicular artery injury. Coming to the anterior approaches, the transthoracic approach, it requires it is an intrapleural approach, and the lung has to be deflated. So one can easily remove the herniated disc, the PLL, and it provides best visualization of the large midline calcified herniated disc. One can access multiple levels, and even if fusion is required, fusion can be done through the same approach. However, it is painful because of the thoracotomy involved, and there is need of chest tube insertion. Thoracoscopic is a minimally invasive approach. It provides visualization of the large midline calcified or soft disc herniations, and one can access up to 3 levels from the same incision, but it requires chest tube insertion, and there is steep learning curve. Coming to literature review, this was a recent article published in British Journal of Neurosurgery, in which the authors have compared transthoracic versus retropleural approach in 94 cases. So what they found was that the pulmonary complications were significantly higher in the transthoracic approaches as compared to retropleural approaches. However, the neurological outcome was the same in both the approaches. So they have recommended that one should prefer retropleural approaches as compared to transthoracic approaches. This was a recent article published in Global Spinal Journal, in which the authors have mentioned their experience about transforaminal thoracic interbody fusion for thoracic disc prolapse. They had 18 cases, and out of these 18 cases, more than 70% had calcified disc herniation, and 60% and around 50% had central disc prolapse, and 8 patients had giant disc herniation. These in this series, mainly 2 approaches were used, either a transpedicular approach or a lateral extracavitary approach. And they have described that they have used 2 types of incision for transpedicular approach, either midline incision or T-shaped incision. They found that this is the corridor provided by the standard midline incision. And if they add if they change the skin incision to a T-shaped incision, they get an extra 10 degree for approaching the thoracic disc herniation. While this is the working field which they got with lateral extracavitary approach, as we can see that for central disc herniations, lateral extracavitary is a better approach because it provides us more horizontal access to the disc herniation. This is one of the cases which they have shown. This is large central calcified disc herniation, for which they have done a single level TLIF. In this case, they had 2 complications. In 2 patients, they operated on the wrong levels, and these 2 patients, in one patient, the wrong level was identified intraoperatively itself when they couldn't find the compression. And while one patient deteriorated neurologically after surgery at a wrong level, and was investigated and imaging was redone, and it was found that the patient was operated at wrong level. So they have mentioned that identifying the right level in thoracic spine can be difficult at times. This is a recent article published in Neurosurgical Review. It's an interesting approach which they have described. They have described posterior transdural section of giant calcified thoracic disc herniation. They have presented their experience of treating 12 such patients with this approach. This is an illustrative example from their article. This was a central calcified disc herniation, and they have done durotomy, and after opening the dura, they have excised the disc. However, the point to note is that in their series, 4 out of 12 patients had neurological deterioration in the immediate postoperative period. However, they mentioned that at the last outcome, all the patients improved, and no patient had clinical deterioration. This is a chart which shows the complications from a pool data of more than 250 thoracic discectomies. We can see that the chances of paresis or loss of bowel bladder function are maximum in the laminectomy, while the pulmonary complications are maximum in the transthoracic approaches. This is a systematic review which was published in 2017, and this review included 37 clinical studies with more than 1,300 thoracic disc herniation levels, And the result was that the neurological outcome between anterior and posterior, mind you, in posterior they have included laminectomy, transpedicular, and posterolateral approaches, costotransversectomy and LECA. The outcome was same, while the posterior approach yielded a low rate of total complications. Hence, they have advocated that anterior approaches should only be used when there is proper expertise available and when there is proper absolute indication for that. This was a recent article published in Global Spine Journal. This is from United States, in which they have compared posterior and anterior approach in more than 1400 cases, and they have described that the various complications are significantly less in the posterior group as compared to transthoracic approaches. So now we know that the literature recommends that posterior approach or posterior lateral approach should be the preferred approach if the pathology can be addressed with that. Now the next question is fusion required in every case? Suppose if we do a lateral extracavity approach, do we need to do fusion? There are many studies which have recommended that the fusion should be reserved for cases when posterior midline structure is removed along with pedicle and rib head, or when there is more than more than 50% of the vertebral body is removed, or when there are some coexisting pathologies, then fusion can be done. Fusion is required. Now the next question is, if one has chosen to fuse the level, can we do away with just unilateral fusion? The literature is available on this topic, mostly from lumbar spine, and there are many studies, many biomechanical and clinical studies, which have shown that a unilateral pedicle screw fixation is as good as bilateral fusion. Now, as the study published in Global Spine Journal showed that they operated on wrong level in 2 patients. This was a recent article published last month only, which has proposed a new method to localize the desired level. They have done a preoperative CT fluoroscopy guided percutaneous gold fiducial marker placement in 57 patients. It's basically like we do vertebroplasty or kyphoplasty, and they have placed a small gold fiducial. I think it's around 1.2 mm into 1 mm size. So they have this is the needle, like the vertebroplasty needle, and through that they have placed this marker, this fiducial in the pedicle, and then they have confirmed the level using a CT scan. This was done a day before the day of surgery, and this is how the fiducial marker looked on the intraoperative X-ray. So summarizing, posterolateral approaches has the advantage of less cord handling, less pulmonary complications, but if a significant bone has been removed, they might require fixation. While the transthoracic approaches provide the best view to the ventral part of the dura, but they are associated with more pulmonary complications, and if more than 50% of the body has been drilled, then they may require fixation. Thank you. I think I will invite Dr. Sachin now to take us forward from here.
Dr. Kale.
Okay, I think, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah. Can I make a small comment on one of the approaches Dr. Kawaljit has discussed?
Yeah, please do. Please do.
Yeah. Actually, the transdural approach after laminectomy, which he was quoting 12 cases, I have done in around 5 cases. And what the trick is that you have to open the dura wide open, and then at least 2 dentate ligament you have to cut on that side. So you can very gently retract the cord to other side. Once you've cut the dentate ligament, the cord becomes mobile. The only problem is if it is comparatively a soft disc or desiccated disc, it is easy to remove. But if it is a highly calcified disc, and if you have to drill it off from that route, the chances of drill skidding and hurting the cord are quite high. So that, but if it is soft disc, it is easily doable. It doesn't harm. I have experience of around 5 cases. In one calcified, I had a problem because my disc started skidding my drill, so I had to stop it.
Okay, any comments to be added by Dr. Raja Kumar or Dr. Muthu Kumar? One by one, please.
I think the point to be made to the audience, especially the younger members of the audience, is that I think Rajkumar did mention that in the passing that the transpedicle approach, transfacetal approach should be used only for soft disk, which, as was pointed out in the literature review by Kanwaljit Kaur, it should not be used for calcified disk because it's a transfacetal disk removal. It's an indirect disk removal where you don't directly visualize the disk. So it's an indirect disk removal, so which is not suitable for a calcified disk. And one of the problems with pointed out in the literature review is the wrong level surgery, which is very common in the mid and lower thoracic levels. So I think this placing this fiducial marker is a good technique. Probably we should learn to adopt that.
Dr. Raja Kumar, any comments? I think he's not online, right?
No, sir, you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, is it better now?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah.
So some of the few things we do is we don't place a fiducial marker. At L1, we put a percutaneous needle or something like a K-wire or a probe into the L1, like we do before inserting a pedicle screw. Just tap it inside. So L1 is known. From L1 to calculate the T12, T11, T10 becomes far easier. And then once the levels are perfectly analyzed, we can take it out. That's not a problem. That's one small trick we do. We don't place the fiducial. I think gold is only good if you have the money for it. But anyway, that's a very interesting way of looking at it. The other thing is, specific to each case, one should learn to modify the approach. People should try to do a transpedicular approach for a soft disk or a lateral hard disk. If it is a calcified hard disk, like here in the central, I, in my hands, would hesitate to do a laminectomy or a posterolateral approach. I would rather rely on a more anterior approach. This is my thought in this specific case. But I must say, a very good review for Kanwaljit. Very good. I appreciate what you've done, the effort you've put in.
Dr. Kaib, I think Pragnesh Bhatt wants to say something. He's raising his hand. You will have to unmute him if you want him to talk.
I am unmuted. Thank you very much, Dr. Dev Pujari, for noticing my hand, which I will now lower. Very interesting webinar, thoroughly enjoyed as usual. May I make two comments? First of all, extensive and very nice review of literature and threadbare discussions. We have published our experience of transthoracic approach to thoracic calcified central discs in WFNS textbooks from Indian publishers, number one. And we have recently started using tantalum beads. Now I know there is a money matter here. And recently the tantalum procurement was also a challenge. We are told that it comes in 12 beads from Canada, which we are going to source next. We also have a problem of having a single sterile pack, which is a silly rule in Scotland. But in the occasional situation, in the last two cases, we have used a breast wire. Breast surgeons use special wires to locate the tumors, though it is not as good as this transpedicular tantalum beads. But the one message for younger generation is that do not rely on cardiothoracic surgeons' calculations. We initially, when we started here, the cardiothoracic surgeons were very confident that they can count the ribs from top to bottom by their hand. We have been wrong more than one occasions, and it was only neurosurgeons' obsession that helped to get the right level. The father of the spine surgery in Britain, Gordon Findlay, used to say that the three commonest complications of spine surgery, which is most appropriate in thoracic disc, is wrong level, and wrong level. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pragnesh. Excellent comments. Thank you very much for appreciating this new style of the webinar. However, I just want to emphasize one point which Dr. Pragnesh mentioned, that the most common complication in spine surgery is wrong level, as he rightly said. And I think personally, you should make all efforts possible to make sure that at least you're not in the wrong level, because wrong level surgery not only gives it gives a very bad outcome to the patient, but it also might lead to litigation. And the most common cause of litigation in spine surgery is wrong level, which is a well-known fact all over the world. And it's not only in UK, but it is true for America. It is true for European literature, everywhere. Wrong level. So one must make every attempt possible to be sure that you are at the right level of surgery, especially in the thoracic spine, because it's all levels look the same. However, so I think let us proceed in the interest of time. Please carry on, Sachin. Sachin is now going to tell us what did we do in AIMS and what problems did we face. Okay, Sachin, over to you.
Yeah. So my screen is visible again?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we discuss all these things. So what are the anticipated difficulties in this case? We had a thorough discussion among all the members of our team that this case has a high risk of neurological deterioration. And obviously the dura may also be calcified ventrally, and there is a risk of CSF leak, and how we are going to manage that in case if it happens. So after much deliberation, what we planned for a lateral extracavitary approach, the posterolateral approach. Since it was center and more on the left side, we took approach it from the left side on an Allen table with a C arm. So the incision was a T-shaped incision. This T is over the 9th rib, and this is the midline. As we anticipated a lot of bone removal, we fixed it up front. So I put a pedicle screw above and below the D7, D8, D9 level. Sorry, the D8, D9, D10 level on the right side. On the left side, since we had to remove the D9 rib, so we put the screw one level above and one level below, and we plan to do an extracavitary approach on the left side. This is the T, and these skin flaps have been reflected. This was the initial part. We just put the screws in, and this was the in-drop picture. Then we then did isolate the erector spinae. So some people try to preserve this erector spinae and work around the erector spinae, but since this is a bulky muscle, we decided to cut it and then stitch it back later on. So we just cut it, and then our rib and the intercostal muscles got exposed. We did a subperiosteal dissection over the 9th rib, and as we had to go extracavitary, lateral extracavitary, we almost exposed up to 8 to 9 centimeter of ribs from the transverse process rib junction. Around 8 centimeter ribs was exposed subperiosteally. Care was taken to preserve the neurovascular bundle which lies in the lower part of the rib, and obviously the pleural was taken care of. Then the next step was to do the rib resection using the rib shear, and then using this tail gauze, we just elevated this rib. So the pleura fell back, and there was no pleural injury. And then we go towards the center, disarticulate it from the transverse process, and move it forwards towards the body. So this was after the rib removal. Almost 8 centimeter of rib was removed, and this was the picture. So I also performed a laminectomy to have some visualization of the thecal sac. So I'm under control, and then started drilling it first with the cutting drill, and in the last part with the diamond drill. So this patient is in prone position. We have removed around 8 centimeter of rib, and now we are drilling it. So the patient is on Allen's table. So what I could do is remove a significant portion of the calcified disc. However, what is happening is this drill is almost horizontal to the the pleura. Still, the most tip of that compression, which is the tip of the mountain, is still a bit blind, despite the drill being almost horizontal. So that was an issue, and since it was an Allen table, we couldn't tilt it much. So retrospectively, I realized that that was a mistake to take her on an Allen table, and we could have taken her on a normal table in which it could have been tilted far better than this. So despite drilling, we were not confident that we have removed it completely, and I was sure that we have left that piece, which is the most prominent compression at the tip of the mountain. So it was already evening, so I thought we should stop now and come back again, but preferably now in a lateral position, which will give us a direct visualization of that remaining compression. So the problem we faced was that in spite of the retracting the pleura and working at a horizontal angle to visualize the disc, the complete disc couldn't be removed in the first sitting. So we planned for the next stage. All the MEPs were intact, so we were safe. So we now planned the patient for disc excision in lateral position on a normal table, which was tiltable and could be manipulated on both sides. And with the left side up, we took the patient 2 days later. And this was the position. The intraoperative neuromonitoring was used again. And we just put the patient left side up. This was the T incision. We just now have to open this incision and directly see the residual compression and do it. So this time, when we opened it, the space ventral to the cord could be visualized by slightly tilting towards either side. Dura was adhered to the disc, so calcified disc fragment was drilled as much as possible, and a tiny island of bone was made free from the vertebral attachment, and it was kept floating attached to the dura, as we do with an ossified OPLL in cervical spine. So we just isolated that, and tiny fragment we left behind. But there was good decompression. There was no dural tear, no CSF leak. And this was the post-operative CT, which shows that compression, which was calcified ventrally, has gone. We also has sacrificed some part of the body to get to that level. And this is the post-operative CT, which shows good decompression. A tiny fragment which was calcified was left attached to the dura. However, it's a good decompression. And we already fixed and put a lot of bone grafts of the harvested from the rib as well as locally, and put it posterolaterally. The screws were perfectly placed. And this is the post-operative CT images. So the technical challenges in this case was, since it was the critical location of the spinal cord, we wanted minimal manipulation of the cord while simultaneously achieving a good decompression. The patient was ambulatory. She had minimal symptoms. So any neurological deterioration post-operative may have been unacceptable. And the midline calcified disc was tough to drill in prone position despite an extracavitary approach. So however lateral you go, this case can still pose a challenge if there is no room for tilting the table or so. So dura was again adhered to the calcified disc. That was another challenge. So what I was telling in the prone versus the lateral approach, if we see it as a prone approach, the LECA gives us this trajectory towards approaching the disc. Again, this portion is again blind, maybe blind despite a good amount of rib excision. However, if we tilt the patient in a lateral position, your trajectory becomes straight, and you can safely remove this under visualization, under direct microscopic visualization. So on follow-up, this is the immediate follow-up. She's walking, her spasticity is decreased immediately post-op, and it's now been 1 year now, and she's completely relieved of her symptoms. No stiffness, no sensory disturbance, no backache, whatever the symptoms she had, all are gone. So to conclude, and the take-home message is the dorsal calcified disc is a difficult pathology to treat, especially if it is central. Needs careful planning. We had a lot of discussion in our department how to approach it, and again we decided for a posterolateral approach. Either a posterolateral or anterior approach may be suitable, as Kawaljeet rightly said in his literature review. Laminectomy alone is not suitable and should not be done. And intraoperative neuromonitoring is an important adjunct in all these surgeries. So this is my take-home message. So I now ask Dr. Kale to take over.
Okay, thank you, Sachin, and thank you, Kawaljeet. I think it was with a little hiccup, but ultimately the outcome was good. So now I again invite the panel, starting from Dr. Lokendra Singh, and then followed by Dr. Raja Kumar, and then finally Dr. Muthu Kumar for their comments on this whole this case. So Dr. Lokendra Singh, please.
Yeah. Thank you, Shashank. I'll put my points one by one in very short, crisp manner. First of all, I will do these cases always by posterolateral approaches. Actually, this lateral extracavitary approach is nothing but same, almost costotransversectomy modified. Secondly, I never will do this patient in prone position. It should be in modified costotransversectomy approach, because if it is totally lateral approach to begin with, then the removal of rib and all that part will become slightly awkward to operate. But in later part, the lateral position is good. But rather than that, if you put the patient, as I said in the beginning, with unequal bolsters, which give you 30-degree tilt without tilting the table, and then extra 30 degrees tilt of the table give you 60 degree, which is good enough to work around this pathology. That is second point. Third point, by and large, fixation may not be needed. I don't do laminectomy. I just follow the intercostal nerve, which takes me to the intervertebral foramen. I work around it, and I can see the dura without really doing any laminectomy. So you have to follow the intercostal nerve. That is third thing. If fixation is required, if my gut feeling is, and I feel that fixation has to be done, I don't do bilateral fixation here. I've done many unilateral fixation on the lateral part of the vertebral body. You can put screws there. The only thing is, because your table is tilted, so you should know how much the table is tilted. So accordingly, you have to adjust a screw. Otherwise, you can go into wrong place. So once you know the direction of your table tilt and degree, you can put the screws properly. CSFly, if it is there, it can be there sometimes. Then you can put the glue. But one thing I want to tell, there is one equipment known as reverse curette. The reverse curette is an extremely important. One is simple curette, one is reverse curette, which curettes downwards actually. So you can drill, and with the reverse curette you can break the calcified part downward into the drilled cavity rather than going upwards. And that's a very, very important piece of equipment you can have. And the people who don't have endoscope, they need not to be bothered about it. They can use a dental mirror to pass into the cavity, a small mirror, and then they can see where the spur is, and then they can drill it under that. It helps in that. I have never used neuromonitoring because I don't have it. And I'm very sure, leave aside 5 to 7% of the total, maybe less than that actually in all over country. So it is not mandatory, it is good to have, and it is important. I'm not saying I would like to have it, but there are many centers who cannot afford in the very beginning, they have more priorities before that. Even without neuromonitoring, having good surgical technique, microscopic techniques, one can remove it and do without monitoring also. But if you can afford monitoring, please afford take it. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Raja Kumar, your comments, please.
You're asking me?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
So I think I would do conceptually one important differentiation at this point. Any posterolateral approach, you're trying to manipulate around the nerve, going from behind and then try to go in front. Whereas if you do a transthoracic approach, you are in front of the nerve, you're in front of the dura. So for me, it's an advantage. And I have said earlier, I do a transthoracic extrapleural approach. If a worse situation comes, I just open the pleura. So therefore, all the planning is obviated if you know to what extent is the angle that you need to approach it, whether to the center of the disc or to the edge of a disc. If you know you're going to the central and more towards the hump inside the center, it requires a more and more anterior approach. So I would do a little piece of rib resection, go transthoracic extrapleural, reach that disc area. And actually, I was surprised. I think AIIMS has C-arm. I mean, not just C-arm, you have O-arm. O-arm helps in identifying the level far better than all the other things we are doing with C-arm. O-arm will give you a far better localization. And if there's a calcification, it becomes very easy to localize. So I think even during surgery, whatever is remaining, if it is calcified, O-arm picks up and you can continue your resection based on what images are there on the O-arm. However, in a particular case like this, I would still hesitate to do a posterolateral. I would do a anterior or a totally lateral approach in a lateral position. Neuromonitoring is a given nowadays. Dr. Lokendra Singh has enough experience. The young surgeons should start looking for getting neuromonitoring at the earliest and learn to use it, because sometimes it's a lifesaver.
Okay, so Dr. Muthukumar, final comment.
I think let's start with neuromonitoring. I think as Rajkumar has said, neuromonitoring is a given for me. For the past 5 years, I've been using it. And this case, I would hesitate to touch without neuromonitoring, even though prior to 2015, I have done many cases without neuromonitoring. And as far as the surgical technique is concerned, as I said in the beginning, posterolateral is still a good approach. Lateral extracavity is still a good approach. The disadvantage in this particular case was Allen's table was used, so which made the surgeon, it was impossible for the surgeon to tilt the patient. So if only during the primary surgery a routine table had been used, the table could have been tilted. And in this particular case, whenever I do a transfacetal approach, of course, in this particular case, I would have gone for a posterolateral approach. So in several transfacetal cases, I have done a unilateral fusion with good results. So in this particular case also, I think a unilateral fusion should be good enough, because thoracic cage is a reasonably, T8, T9 is a reasonably stable level, and you have removed hardly 40% of the vertebral body. I think it should be good enough to do a unilateral fusion with the patient in the prone position. Then you put the pedicle screws, then go ahead and tilt the table, expose, and proceed with the removal of the calcified disc. That could have been done. So that way, the second, of course, all this is hindsight. All this is hindsight. And I think any one of us could have been in the same situation. And I should congratulate Sachin for, postponing the surgery for a second day, because if you find it very difficult after a long day, because the time you reach the calcified portion, if you have already spent 7-8 hours, you are already fatigued, and that's the time when you are likely to make mistakes. So no harm in closing up and coming again on another day. This is a good way to do that.
Okay, so we have good comments from all the panelists, and I will just summarize in 2 lines. Basic thing is, I always like to say that what I was told by our seniors here: look before you leap. That's a very simple message. I'm sure many of us would have heard it in different context, but for a surgical resident or for a surgical trainee, this becomes the most important thing before you plan or before you venture into any surgery. Look before you leap. You please see where you are jumping, and please see how you are jumping. Please see from where you are jumping. Do you have enough equipment? Do you have everything? Do you have the right level, etc., etc.? And then the list can be endless, which it can include neuro monitoring. Another interesting thing which I would like to tell Dr. Lokendra Singh, which I saw in Jaipur, I was invited for something and I was operating on something, and there was this neuro monitoring available there. So I asked them that, where did you get this neuro monitoring? I didn't know that there was neuro monitoring. They said it's available for hire. You can hire it on a per case basis, and the person comes with all the equipment and he sets it up for you, and after the case he takes it back. And I thought that was a brilliant idea, and somebody is doing good business, just trying to give neuro monitoring to how many ever cases he can. And so this is available. If anybody does want to use and he doesn't have the equipment, or the hospital is unable to procure this equipment because it's expensive, then this is available for hire. And believe me, that person was very well experienced. He must have assisted or set it up in 100 cases before he assisted me, and he knew what he was doing. So such things are available. So please take utmost care. If you can, please use neuro monitoring. I think it's time to
Shashank,
wrap up. Yes, sir.
just to let you know, Medtronic has a similar facility available in Mumbai. There is another private company which has it available not only in Mumbai but in 6 other cities, and they have actually trained technicians.
Yeah.
So there is a facility available like this in India. And when we say that something is expensive or something is cheap, I think we buy an equipment like KUSA for mainly our comfort and to save our time. So we have to decide between what is important for the patient care and what is important for us. I mean, I'm sure it increases precision of tumor excision, but I'm not against this. But whoever it is possible, I think it is good to use. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Can I
another
just
aspect is,
comment?
just one more point I would like to add. Important aspect is the litigation part of it. If you haven't used it and the patient lands up into a bad outcome and it goes to court, and I have seen it, I've been asked as an expert witness in many cases, and if for some reason it was not used, then we are in trouble. Then we as surgeons are in trouble. So one must think of that too while planning for all this, and make utmost efforts to procure it if you can, even if it is for hire for a single case. But if we can, then we are saved from a lot of trouble in future in case the outcome is bad. In case the outcome is good, of course, nothing matters.
Can
So
I make
we
a
come
comment,
to an
Dr.
end,
Kale?
sir.
Can I make a comment, Dr. Kale?
Yeah, final comment from Dr. Muthukumar, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yes, this is regarding the neuro monitoring which you have been mentioning. It's all nice to have neuro monitoring, but then I have tried 3-4 such groups which you have mentioned, and sometimes not all the technicians are well trained. I have had some false positives and false negative, which have really made my life difficult. So when you make sure you are hiring somebody, make sure you hire the same person, and your anesthetic team should also be adequately equipped to deal with TIVA, total intravenous anesthesia. So it's not just the neuromonitoring team. Your anesthesia team should also be in sync with the surgeon, the anesthetist, and the neuromonitoring team should be in sync. They should know, we should tell the neuromonitor, the neurophysiologist, when I need an MEP. So SSCP is a continuous run. When you need an MEP, at what stage you need an MEP. So these are certain things which we realize in supine position, we have to do it in the baseline, and then after we turn the patient prone, we have to repeat the recordings before we start the surgery. These are certain things which I learned the hard way.
Yeah, so I mean, I consider myself extremely lucky to be in a place like All India Institute, where I don't have to think about all these things, because all these things are there, and the anesthetists are excellent, and they are trained, and the physiologists and the anesthetists talk to each other, and I don't even have to say anything. So I think that's extremely lucky as far as I'm concerned. However, all these are valid points. Yes, sir.
Yeah, because the last point should be mine, because I was the one who said that neuro monitoring, I said you should have it. But if you don't have, question is, the patient is not affording, are you going to send, where are you going to send them? Can you send all of them to All India Institute or Bombay Hospital or Madurai? You see what I'm saying? You should have it. But if you don't have it, are you going to turn away patients? And can you send all poor patients from villages? Because probably you people see all good patients, rich patients. Where are you going to send those
We
patients?
don't.
Where? No, All India Institute is a free treatment. So please.
Yeah.
So don't compare All India Institute. How many All India Institute can be there in the country? It's a country of 1 billion and 30 crore people. So please think from that angle practically also.
Yes, sir. Very rightly said. Cost is an issue, definitely. And not only is it expensive for the patient, it is also expensive for the hospital management. So I can understand that in a government setup, things are entirely different. But thankfully, the government of India is now trying to make 22 AIIMS all over the country, including in your respective cities, Dr. Muthukumar and Dr. Lokendra Singh. The AIIMS is going to come to your cities soon, and if it has not come there already. Anyhow, I think this brings us to an end to the discussion. We must wrap it up. We are way beyond time. So thank you very much, and I now hand it over. Let me thank the panelists, Dr. Muthukumar, Dr. Lokendra Singh, and Dr. Raja Kumar Deshpande. Excellent discussion. Thank you to the NSI for making this event possible, so that everybody was doubting one case discussion too much, but I guess it helps. Everything helps. Any teaching, whether it is one case or 100 cases, everything helps. And the most important thing is the discussion part. I think so. And the discussion was excellent.
I'm happy that you chose a case where there is a lot of learning. There is a lot of learning, not only in terms of diagnosis, investigation, but several ways of managing and the managing difficulties. I think so. In all senses, it became a very good sample case to start with, and I'm very happy that we should be able to carry this further from 21st November onwards on Saturday.
Fantastic format, Dr. Dev Pujari. I must congratulate you because I requested you to start spine series, because perennial everybody talks, and you have really wonderfully planned it. It is extremely good to see this sort of discussion. I think this is well done.
I think just
thank you very much, sir. I just want to thank Dr. Sachin and Dr. Kamalji. They really worked hard, and I can have the luxury of not doing anything and still hog all the limelight. That's the way the heads of departments work. But anyhow, they really worked hard, and my thanks to Sachin and Kamalji. Yes, sir, Dr. Muthukumar.
Navneet ji, can you please show the slide for the next program? I would just like to announce before Muthukumar bids bye to everybody. I would just like to request everybody to be available for next webinar. It is in a different format altogether, and we are actually trying to look at several influences which guide our practices today. And we have some experienced people to talk about the various aspects of decision making in your field of practice, including academic versus community practice, public versus corporate healthcare, as well as clinical dilemmas and the Indian cultural influences. So I request all of our members to take advantage of this, and over to Muthukumar for the final
just to take a word out of Dr. Kale's last concluding remark that you should look before you leave. So in that context, I think the next week's webinar, decision making, should be a interesting topic for all our members. So I expect our members to participate in large numbers. Thank you. And thank you to the NSI office, Navneet and Kiran Arora, for the technical support.